For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. Today's guest is Bruce Temkin, founder of Humanity at Scale, an initiative to reimagine enterprise leadership organized around the prioritization of people. At a time when the debate is around the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs, productivity, society, perhaps even happiness, what could be a more essential focus? Now, for many of you, I suspect Bruce is probably already familiar for his work with the research firm Forrester, where he covered customer experience technologies. But he successfully leveraged that experience into his own firm, the Temkin Group, which he sold to Qualtrics in 2018, and from where he continued to drive thought leadership in the CX space. Oh, and he co-founded CXPA in the meantime. In regards to his new initiative, Humanity at Scale, Temkin explains that despite decades of progress in CX and employee experience, many leaders still perceive a trade-off between focusing on people and achieving business results. His goal is to eliminate this false dichotomy by helping leaders understand that truly human-centric organizations, those that embrace how people naturally think, feel, and behave, are in fact more productive, adaptable, and capable of long-term success. Drawing on principles from neuroscience, behavioral economics, Bruce argues that organizations need to shift from rule-heavy, process-centric structures to environments that encourage creativity and human connection. Naturally, the conversation also dives into the societal and organizational implications of artificial intelligence. Bruce acknowledges the disruptive potential for AI, but he remains fundamentally optimistic. He asserts that, like prior technological revolutions, AI can elevate standards of living and open new opportunities, if of course it's applied thoughtfully. He does caution, however, that businesses often default to short-term cost-cutting, such as automating human interactions in contact centers, rather than leveraging AI to enhance productivity and employee fulfillment. Temkin also introduces the concept of bias denialism, where he encourages leaders to accept that all data and decisions are inherently biased. Recognizing and working with that bias, he would argue, is essential to true human-centered leadership. His ultimate ambition is to spark a movement that inspires leaders, shares practical practices, and promotes AI applications that serve humanity rather than diminish it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Bruce Temkin, thank you very much for joining us here today on the CX Iconoclast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you and I go further back than I probably want to relate to, because it will reveal the fact that we're not quite the young man that we might have been way back in the day. I think it was back in the 1990s, which we must have been at high school together if it was that era. But
I'm sure.
It's fair to say that you've had a storied career in the CX industry. You've been one of the sort of fixtures of the entire space. And tempting as it is to go and reflect on all of that, I think it's perhaps much more positive and interesting to talk about your new endeavor, because this is quite unique and remarkable, and I think also quite timely. And you obviously have a lot of passion for it. So let's just start and dive right in about this idea of humanity at scale. And perhaps you could just start by explaining what is all this about and why on earth are you doing it?
Sure. And one of my most exciting topics to talk about. So humanity at scale, as you mentioned, I've been in the experience management, customer experience, employee experience field for, like we say, longer than we like to talk about. And one of the things that I realized is I felt good about the impact that I've had on organizations and how they operate and how they're more focused on the people. But I realized that I wanted to have a bigger impact. So I created Humanity at Scale because what I realized is there's a fundamental problem with being human-centric in organizations, and that is that leaders think that there is a trade-off between focusing on people and driving results. And that fundamental trade-off, that flaw in thinking, is actually what has gotten in the way of a lot of those customer experience and employee experience types of of efforts that I've worked on over the years. But I realize that fundamental issue that leaders still do not understand how to and where to and why to focus on people to drive the results that they want. So Humanity at Scale is an effort to inspire and empower leaders to create human-centric organizations, to have the tools, the understanding, and the motivation to focus on people in ways that sustains the types of results that they want to have over long periods of time.
But leadership always says people are the center of our business, right? So on the surface, this is motherhood and apple pie, as we say. It's right what we all believe in. The people are the most important part of our enterprise. We put our people, maybe not first, but they're close second behind customers, maybe, and certainly ahead of those pesky shareholders. So what is it? But you're suggesting that actually, to some extent, even if that's a bromide, they may say that, but fundamentally they see it as a trade-off. And how do you perceive that trade-off, man? Is it cost related? Is it just that people represent a inefficiency, or where is the trade-off that the management team seem to be making here?
Yeah, and interesting. When I think about people, I think about all the people that they're serving. And you're right. There's no one who would inherently say we're not focusing on people. But what happens is they get focused on processes, they get focused on metrics, they get focused on other things, and lose sight of what is the day-to-day, month-to-month world lived experiences of customers and employees in the community they serve. And so it's interesting when I think about the early days of customer experience. A lot of my work was recognizing that there was a user experience field that had some interesting elements, and there was a product experience field that was product design. It wasn't experience then, product design field, and then bringing those into a broader context for customer experience. Now what I've realized is I've spent a lot of my career focusing on sort of human experience design by looking at things like neuroscience and behavioral economics, and recognizing that people behave in ways that we can anticipate. And that's what's missing in how leaders think and do what they're doing, which is they don't factor in the reality of how people act and respond to situations. And so it's the trade-off they're thinking about, is because to some degree, the customer experience movement has ingrained in them the thought that you either have to focus on your business results, or don't focus on that, focus on customer experience. So it's embedded a little bit in leaders, this belief that if I'm going to focus on humanity and people, it's at the cost of something else. And what I'm trying to teach them is that if you really did understand how all the people you touch respond to the things that you do, you can actually drive your success and leave behind a legacy that's much more positive and not have to make that trade-off.
It's almost like a rebuke of Taylorism. You go back to the whole concept of efficiency in enterprise post Second World War, right? You're supposed to standardize everything, break tasks down to very simple components, make them highly repetitious, a sort of manufacturing mentality about the whole thing. And people are kind of quasi machines in that model. If you think about it, they're regarded as somewhat less efficient robots, and less efficient robots need to be put in place processes, they need control mechanisms. And the only way we're going to get good at business is that we're going to become more and more controlling in the way in which people do their jobs, and essentially take away the variance, which is intrinsically human, but perceived as an inefficiency. And so you've got this massive wave going on for decades that say, how do we strip efficiency, followed by, well, ultimately, can we get robots to become cheap enough to simply remove people for the equation? Probably offshoring of jobs is somewhere in the middle of all that as a way to take another efficiency leap. You're almost making an argument that says, okay, look, there's a different way to do business here, and presumably the upside to this shows up as productivity, creativity, an organization that, if functioning healthily, and I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but what definition you want, but a healthy organization that understands the humanity of the people within and outside the organization turns out to be more productive. Is that ultimately the win?
Great. You've described it very effectively. And I want to go back to that, excuse me, the history of the companies and how they've been for the last decades. One of the things that if you look at traditional leadership and management training, they're trained on, like you said, efficiency and effectiveness. And so what that has translated into is embedding rules and process on top of things, right? So if something is broken, the natural inclination of every leader is, or just about every leader, I shouldn't say every, there are some inspired ones, but lots of leaders, is to put on top of that more process, more rules, narrow the scope of activities that employees and even customers can do to keep that issue from coming up again. So we pile on these structures. But you know what? If the company is successful, because leaders have that point of view that success is driven by process and rules, the feedback they get is that process and rules are driving our success. So we should probably put more process and rules on top of that to drive even more success. So what we've ended up with is a position where almost every organization I've seen, and I've seen hundreds or thousands of them, has way too much process and way too many rules. And it may not feel like that because the only way they're managing is through process and rules. So they always feel like they don't have enough. And I think that if we want to think about how human beings behave, if we put them in a bucket and treat them like narrow operating robots who have finite amount of skills, that is how they are going to behave, right? So we've almost self-fulfilled the poor performance and the poor commitment of our employees because we're treating them like that to begin with.
Yeah, it's what popped into my head when you're saying that was, it's like we're trying to create somewhat more expensive robots, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to converge people with the behavior of algorithms. You know, we want them to essentially respond in the way we think they should respond. So you could, so I suppose that at the argument is, and by the way, I buy this. I mean, it's not hard to see the appeal of it. I think the idea here is that ultimately we're playing to the worst aspects of people, and we're missing the best aspects of it. And you know, in developed countries, we have a different problem. We need to increase productivity, right? We're not going to compete on a pure labor per hour rate with developing countries, as we've seen with China. And you could argue that a lot of the current economic backlash that's associated with offshoring of jobs has been associated with this desire to sort of take human costs down to the lowest possible level and create, you know, very standardized processes. We're not going to win that game, you know, a developed nation like the United States or Europe for that matter. We're going to have to find a way to harness people's creativity and productivity. So maybe a different angle to look at it is that the developing countries are always going to win the race to the bottom. They're going to win the race to creating essentially human robots. So we need to win the race to creating, you know, far more productive, happy. I'm sounding like Radiohead's "OK Robot" here. OK Computer. So happier, more fulfilled people who are therefore more creative, and you know are capable of actually delivering much higher output through mechanisms that aren't going to be as standardized as we like, but play to the fact that that's what humans are really good at. We're good at being creative. We're good at being flexible.
I think that's a good description. The more routine the task is, right, the more it does appeal to robots and automation. And so the organizations that are creative and responsive and adjust to different market conditions can't be driven by robots, right? Because we need that creativity and adjustments. And so I do think that there is a look at the focus of different countries and different regions about whether they want to be in the business of routinizing and repeating basic work that ultimately, and I agree, most you get it down to some level, and robots are better at that stuff than humans will be. Versus almost all the organizations that sustain success in the developed world are shifting, adjusting, and really the roles that human beings play, both as employees who need to adjust what they do, but also in an understanding of how customers are responding to those things in a very human way. All of that requires leaders who have to think about people as entities that actually respond to environments in different ways that can be anticipated and therefore can be optimized, right? So I don't think we move away from an optimization thinking, right? But we move away from the optimization thinking to how can we make the work that individuals do be so narrow and specific that they deliver the exact same thing and the exact same thing every way, to how do we optimize the value that's being created by human beings for human beings.
Yeah, and so into this comes, the sudden surge of interest and adoption of artificial intelligence, right? And associated with that has been a narrative which has been running a while, which is the robots are going to take your jobs, and robots being a proxy for AI. And we talked to Eric Brynjolfsson about a year ago, and I remember he and McAfee's original book, Race Against the Machine, had really been making an argument that we're not necessarily going to see this transition from humans to AI and robotics, or at least a more positive image, although the data they presented was actually rather upsetting in that sense, because you saw this divergence of economic performance between people who had graduate degrees, even undergraduate degrees, kind of treading water, and anyone who didn't have a college education had sort of lost ground financially over a 20-year period. So the race wasn't being won, I should say, by everybody. It was being won by a very select group who were highly educated. So we've already seen this shift. Now, there's two arguments for AI. One is that AI is going to do to the educated professional classes what manufacturing robotics did to the blue-collar worker, because all of a sudden it's going to make them more productive, which could be interpreted as half the number of people we need, and which means you're a 50-50 chance of losing your job because of that productivity surge. Or the optimistic assessment, I suppose, is that it could become a liberating factor for people to make them more productive, more happy in their jobs. So what's your view on this? How is this going to shape up?
So I think I always sort of look for history for indications of the future, right? And if you look at, all technology in the history of our country, of our collective countries in the Western world, right? Disruptive technology has sort of altered some job opportunities, but has, but in replace of that, they have all created more jobs in the collective and raised the standard of living for everyone. Right. So I think that AI, while it is, I think, a lot more disruptive than just about every other technology we talk about, it still represents the type of technology that will be either applied in a way that raises our standard of living, which means that you take the gains not to lower the costs across the board on everything, but to innovate and create new things and create opportunities, which makes the need for people to actually use the technology in new and novel ways to create that higher standard of living. So I'm a firm believer that you'll see both, right? And so it depends on what your focus is. If you're focused on the displacement of some jobs, because you don't need as many creative writers if you have Chat GPT doing a lot of the creative writing for you. But oh, by the way, creative writers who learn how to use Chat GPT to make the most like compelling stuff is going to raise the standards for everyone, and it's going to help us all. So I do think that there's a shift. You go back in time, you go back 20 years, there was hardly anyone doing, maybe 30 years now, but there's hardly anyone in software engineering, right? So, we create this world around technology, and suddenly there's a whole software engineering sort of set of opportunities that never existed before, that people becoming wealthy with, and people making entire careers out of. So I think that we always, with new technology, go through disruptive periods where some jobs get adjusted. And I like the way you said it. I think I totally agree. This is going to impact a lot of white collar, gold collar. AI can do a lot of what lawyers do, a lot of what accountants do, can do a lot of what doctors do when they're not actually touching a patient, right? So, but think about this way: what happens if AI lowers the cost of our healthcare by 50%, by 75%? What does that do to the standard of living of everyone? That will create jobs that we've never even imagined for people.
So there's two thoughts on that. By the way, on the topic of automating lawyers, as lawyers are typically ranked bottom of the most liked professions, I'm just wondering whether AI lawyers would actually raise the standard, whether people would like AI lawyers better than regular lawyers, or take them to. I can see Morris shaking his head here, but that notwithstanding, it seems to me in the face of that, two problems. One is companies' first instinct is to see this as cost reduction and not see this as an opportunity for productivity. So one of the big things happening with AI, as you know, is it's been a rush to get into the contact center and eliminate jobs because we've got better chatbots, right? And the immediate grab here is, how do we take humanity out of interactions with customers in the contact center, because it's seen as expensive, and come up with better and better ways of eliminating employee cost out of that equation. Now, that's not a new idea. That's been an idea that's been going on for 30 years, right? Call avoidance combined with, cheaper ways of serving people. And I have to say, at least my experience, highly anecdotal, is the results have been somewhat disappointing. That I think that in some extent there's been a bit of a grab for this idea because it's seen as cost reduction without thinking through the ramifications for what that means in terms of delivering great service. So there's this instinct in businesses that say new technology equals cutting out human cost. So that's one thing I'd like you to comment on. And I know two-part questions are kind of messy, but society, to your point, transitions. We've not always done a very good job of transitioning, right? Our tendency is to, certainly in America, where we are capitalism first, and don't get me wrong, I'm a full-throated capitalist. It's kind of like Lord of the Flies here. It's everybody for themselves, right? You move into the new universe, let them eat code, as they say. You go off and you learn to code, or too bad, you're on the scrap heap of history, and that's the way capitalism works, buddy. So we're going to have these two problems, aren't we? One is, no matter what the potential, tendency to just go after simplistic cost reduction, almost anti-humanity. And this tendency to say, as a society, look, you're just collateral damage if you can't get onto the new gravy train.
So I think, there's a lot to unpack there. I do think that there is a bias towards efficiency in applying new technologies, and I never had a problem with that as an initial pass. I find most organizations are, because of this layering on of process and rules, most organizations have become super inefficient relative to their goal. And I don't think efficiency isn't, the lack of efficiency isn't the same as positive humanity, right? I think an organization that is more efficient can serve the people in the company and serve the customers and the community better anyway. Now, the chatbots, totally agree. That was overly deployed, loved in ways that I never could quite understand. and because they did, up until like recently, they did hardly any of the work that human beings could do. But with AI, with Chat GPT and other LLMs, there's a possibility for chatbots to do even more. And I do think that if there's a way to deploy technology to make it both efficient and better for people, right? I don't think people have to be in the mix. But it gets to that second part of the question, which is, do people get left behind? And one of the things about capitalism, and I would say one of the things about the United States in capitalism, not every country is like this, but what separates, I think, the US from the rest of the world is the ability to shift resources, right, as a nation. Because we have a very fluid capital structure, capital flows to opportunity really quickly. What I think people are missing is that capital is more than money. Capital includes the capabilities and skills of human beings, right? And so our ability to actually move people into jobs, to become coders, to learn how to prompt, LLMs effectively to drive your own productivity, those types of skilling are important for the continuation of like a country like the US to continue to be able to, we pretty much jump on whatever the next wave is with all of our capital structure. And I think we've actually done a reasonably good job of shifting our workforce there too. It doesn't seem like it in the moment because shifting a workforce isn't something that happens in a week, a year. But if you look at it, we've done up until now. Now, I will say that our government is currently putting in places that alter our ability, I think, to structure and move and take advantage of emerging capabilities like we have in the past. But in the past, we've done a really good job of retooling our workforce. Now, having said that, there are hundreds of millions of people in the US and billions of people. That doesn't mean that some are left behind. And I feel badly about that. But there are people left behind, even if that shift didn't happen, they'd be left behind in other ways. So I think what you're trading off is, yes, any technology shifts ends up having some people that are left behind, but you have to ask yourself, not how many people is the technology leaving behind, but how many people would have been left behind and not had opportunities had the technology not done the disruption in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that. And you can always look at anecdotes and feel bad about it, but American capitalism is kind of the worst system until you consider the alternatives, right? It's basically got its real shortcomings, but it has worked better in this regard than almost any other system that we've seen over certainly the last 100 years. And I think the more you try and avoid that, as you say, we might be entering into a phase where, in an effort to avoid that happening, we inflict more wounds on ourselves. Who's to say yet? It becomes harder. And certainly in Europe, there's been a tendency to try and, over smooth off the rough edges of capitalism. And that's resulted naturally in more costs and more sclerosis in the labor markets, you could argue. I'm sure a lot of Europeans would vigorously disagree with me in that perspective. One of the things, just changing here, perhaps the last topic I'd love to pick up on is your comments that Morris picked up in one of your most recent newsletters around bias denialism, which sounds like a course they'll be teaching down the road from you at Harvard one day. Perhaps you could explain your point of view on bias denialism.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think it's a great topic to think about being a human-centric leader and what humanity at scale is all about, right? The idea that leaders and just about everyone treat bias as if it's a bad thing, right? So we try to avoid bias. Anytime we hear bias, we say, no, we're not biased. Our work isn't biased. Our day isn't biased. The fact is that everything in the world is biased, right? We as human beings look at the world through the lived experience and the histories that we have, and they're unique to us, right? So the way that each of us as individually looks at everything that happens in the world is unique and different from everyone else, and therefore is biased in how you view it, right? So that article, and part of what I try to teach people is that rather than trying to live in a world where you believe that bias only happens in mistaken times and you don't live in a world where you recognize bias is everywhere. It's not a bad thing. So if you recognize it, then you can start with, okay, the discussion I'm having about whatever topic, everyone else in the room and everyone else in the world may view it differently, right? Because they don't have my point of view, because I am biased. Boy, it helps you there. Any data you look at, like and you'd know this probably as much as anyone, Richard, which is that all the data over the whatever customer, it doesn't matter, customer experience, employee experience, business data, whatever it is, it's all bias because there are decisions about what you're measuring. There are decisions about how you're measuring. There's decisions about the data you're bringing in. All of those things are based on someone somewhere having an opinion about what the right thing to do was. And so you end up with this completely biased system that we've operated effectively in, but we can operate more effectively if we recognize that we have biases, everything around us is biased, and just deal with it in the reality of take. And I'll leave it one question on that I always come back to. One of the quotes that I live by was when I worked at GE and worked for Jack Welch, way back when. He'd always say, deal with the world as it is, not how you'd like it to be. And that always stuck in my mind, which is we have this innate, human beings have this innate need to make the world pretty and structured and have a view on it that fits into our narrative. And I always try to personally break that and say, okay, how does the world really operate? And bias is a part of that real world.
It's a great perspective. I love that. We all have our favorites. I think that the world we live in, my personal favorite is confirmation bias, which I think is,
Yes.
hugely prevalent in a whole field of data and analytics. But, I think once you educate yourself on that, once you accept that we're all subject to confirmation bias, right? Then you start to look at every decision you make or your instinctive reaction to data, your instinctive reaction to information, and start to go, confirmation bias is such a powerful element that how do I know I'm not simply exhibiting it? Or how do I accept that I am and adjust accordingly, right? And take into account other people's perspectives. Right? So I love the idea that embracing this as a reality, it's a shame the term is so associated with negative elements of bias, right? We think of gender and race
Yes.
bias, and that's where people go immediately. And so the word has got this connotation, that's so easily associated with those problems that we almost need a new descriptor now. We need something which is free of that political weight that we could use to apply to this simple fact that, yes, normal bias is an accepted part of life. It's not even bad. It's just human beings and the way we cognitively process things. So maybe
Yeah.
we need a whole new terminology for this. I mean, social scientists and economists can use these words all the time because, yeah, they're talking to each other about it. But Joe Public, or for that matter, most people, I don't want to sound condescending. I mean, most people, when you hear the word bias, immediately go to issues of race or gender. But I think it's a fascinating topic to describe. So just to wrap up here, Bruce, I mean, this is a fascinating topic, and we could probably talk all day about it. I mean, what's your aspiration here? And I hope 9 months from now or something, we get together again, and you're going to be talking about what you've learned and what you've managed to influence. What would be ideal for you to be able to say down the road that this has accomplished?
So my goal with the humanity at scale, and you'll see, like I have on my logo, if you look at it, it says sparking humanity at scale, because I believe that for me, success is not what I do directly, but the influence I have on how people think. right? So in 9 months, or whenever we talk next, whatever it is, I'd like to think that I am doing I've done three things. One is that I am inspired leaders to have ambitions around being humanity centric, right? Step one, I want them to say, okay, I get it. This is something that I want to do. The second thing I want to do is be sharing practices around being humanity centric, right? Because if I've sparked people to be interested, I want to make sure that they say, okay, I've learned to do that in some ways because of some of the work that I've done. And by the way, sparking doesn't mean I have to. I don't care if they learn it wherever. They don't have to learn it from me. And the third is that I want to promote humanity centric technology. So this is mostly AI now. I want to push AI in a direction that is helping humanity, not hurting humanity, because like any technology, it's a neutral tool, and it really depends on how we push it, frame it, and use it. So those are the three things that I hope I'm doing. Then, if in sort of more structural ways in 9 months, I hope to have training and certification around being a humanity centric leader, because I believe that it's a set of tools that will help all leaders achieve the things that they want to do. So that's the structural thing I hope to have in 9 months. But
I think
really, the more important thing is those other stuff.
I think a lot of organizations would embrace that, because to some extent it's an evolution from the, you know, people first bromide point of view that people have had, to say, well, let's actually hang something on it. You know, in some ways, Net Promoter Score, when it was created, gave people something to hang on the idea that we wanted to be customer centric. If you can get organizations to say we've got a structure or an approach that enables us to hang this idea of being humanity first, then I think people would jump at that, because I don't think that exists today, you know, really in a really useful form or a practical form or a transformational form at the enterprise level. So Bruce, nothing but respect for what you're doing, man. I think it's fantastic. I think it's original, really exciting. Can't wait to hear about your progress on this. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Always fun to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.